Hello again. Welcome to another edition of the Brattlecast. It's so much fun to be here. I'm Jordan Rich, and I'm with Ken Gloss, the proprietor of the famous Brattle bookshop in Boston on West Street, very close to the Freedom Trail, and a very important stop on your tour if you're coming in from out of town. But you got so many people from in town that it's tough to even get near the place, which is a good thing.
Well, a lot of those people in town are from out of town, and tourists and students and everybody. So it's great. And usually when you're around Saturday, which is our busiest day, but if you came on a Tuesday morning, it might not be quite as busy.
Okay, Tuesday morning it is. I'll make a note of that. So today we're going to focus on something that's, I think, very personal but very broadly defined, and that is the emotional attachment that people have, particularly to books.
Oh, it's one of the main things that we run into that can be most difficult in many ways. It's when we get calls and someone wants us to come out to their house to look at their books. First of all, we try to get an idea and if it's something we want to look at. But what we definitely tell people is if there's anything that is attached to you, anything that emotionally means something, sentimental, before we get there, go and pick it out, because I can look at a wall of books sometimes very quickly and come up with an offer. And it either works or it doesn't work, but it's just money. I mean, I know that sounds, but it's just money. So either people want what you offer or they don't. Maybe they negotiate a little. But what I can't deal with is someone stopping and say, wait a minute, Uncle Bill gave me that and start hearing the story, then the story on the next one and the next one. You know, it's one of those things that can go on forever. So we tell people to do that. Then the person who's the hardest to buy books from, by far, is the person who collected them. Because the person who collected them remembers where they got it, why they had the books. You know, it's a lot of fun collecting. It's a lot of fun reading them, but it's something that means a lot to them. And we found almost never, when the person doesn't absolutely have to sell, will they sell anything if they're the real collector. They might sell a couple of duplicates so they can buy something new. They might say, well, I'm not interested in this area as much anymore, but I'm keeping all the good things. So the emotional attachment is one of the main things. And when you're going through an estate, and if it's your parents, your uncle, your brother, it's not really about the money. It's what does that book mean to you? So that's one thing that comes up with the emotional. But there are some things that are good and bad with the emotional attachment. I know that when we buy books from a widow, whether it's the husband or wife who collected the books and whoever's selling them, sometimes they have to leave the house. They have to leave where we are when we're carrying them out. Because books are so much a part of the personality of the person that they can't stand to watch, because that's sort of like the painful final thing of leaving.
Right. And it's not just classic old tomes. We're talking about any kind of book. I mean, it might be a cookbook. It might be a sports book. It might be anything.
Right. If, for instance, if the person was very much into one type of sport or another, once that goes, you see the sort of walking out the door. But I've run into actually a few interesting situations with that, and a couple of them are not what you would expect as far as emotional attachment. There was, and I'm going to give 4 or 5 examples. There was a lady that about a year or so ago, we bought. Her husband was a philosophy teacher, professor in Long Island. And not a big house, but every room, floor to ceiling, was lined and walled with books. And there were probably 5,000-6,000 books in the house. And she didn't want everything to go at once. So she said, start in that room. We gave her a price. She bargained about it. And then we bought the books and moved them out and went back. And about 3 weeks later, she called again, but she said, you didn't give me enough money for the first one. And we wanted to get at the others, so we said, okay, we'll raise it a little. It wasn't so much that we didn't give a fair price, but she wanted a little more, and we wanted the rest of the book. So we did it. And this happened another couple of times. And then finally she got really, really upset at us with what we were doing and what we paid. And this time I was sort of sensing that. So not only before we went to Long Island, I sent her a text and saying, we're going to take this many books. We're going to pay you exactly this amount. If that's okay, then we'll come down and do it. And we got a text back saying, fine. And then she was even more upset after we left that time. And what we realized what was really happening, she was elderly, not so elderly, there was no dementia. The price of the book wasn't so much the money she was getting, it was the way we were evaluating her husband. So in other words, she wasn't as concerned about the value of the books, but if it wasn't as high as she thought, it was sort of like disrespecting her husband. The problem is, it wasn't our intention at all. But
no, of course not.
If we had offered her 10 times as much, I still think she would have thought, because her husband was everything to her, and the idea that even any of him was leaving. So it was one of those situations. It was sort of, it was sad in a way, but she needed to sell them. She wanted to get some of the money, and she needed the space in the house.
Well, you also made a long trip to do it. You made the trek to Long Island. So.
Yeah, the ferry and all that. So especially once we sensed things were a little off, we put the offer in writing, gave her like a week to respond to us. Right. But ultimately, it wasn't about what we had offered, what the books were. It was about her
you're
husband.
Very sensitive to this because this has been your career, and you know that this happens regularly. Frequently.
It doesn't happen that often, especially when we've been very explicit. Usually, it isn't. But yeah, there are times where be very aware. In every buy we go on, we tell people to pick out what means something to you first. I always say, look, we can do the big bulk, and then if there's something in there that's particularly valuable, I'll look at it, I'll tell you, you can think about it. A lot of times when you get called out to a house, the emotional part is not what we've offered, it's the families fighting.
Yes.
And we have seen places where you go in, and there'll be a shelf of books, and the shelf will be 20 volumes of a 40-volume set. The next shelf has the 21st through the 40th volume, but one person got this shelf and one person got that shelf. It separated, they're worth nothing, but they would never come to an agreement on no, this should be mine, that should be yours.
Literary Hatfields and McCoys.
Yeah, it's so,
a little bit of that.
So one of the things is you learn a lot about the psychology of the people. There was one time, this was funny, we went over a man, he was a college president, I won't say exactly which one, but an Ivy League college north of here. In any case, he was selling his books, he was ill, he knew he wasn't going to be alive that long, and we bought the collection. And we had another friend who was good friends of him and said, look, I want you to buy his books, but if you could do me a big favor and let me go through them first, because I know there's some that I want, and I didn't want to. He knew that the college person who was a friend would have given it to him, and he didn't want to get it as a gift. So he was going through, and he found 10 or 15 books out of 1,000 that he wanted. But then there was one book that was inscribed to this man who was selling the books by his mother, saying, this book should inspire you, this book should get what you wanted, this book, it went on, a nice long inscription about how inspirational this book should be to you from his mother. And his friend saw that book, picked it out and said, well, he couldn't have meant to let that book go, and got it, gave it back to him. His friend told him that I've been trying to get rid of that book for so long. He says, my mother always said I wasn't doing well enough, and this book was about somebody who was doing very well, and the idea of her inscription, you should do as well as him, was basically saying you're not doing well enough.
Yeah, a little resentment there over the years.
But the idea is that he sold it, got rid of it, another person saw it, got it, gave it back. He couldn't get the book gone. It bounced back on him, and it was it was funny. Now, there's a funny story also about the attachment to books. A famous author, Somerset Maugham, was in Paris looking through a used bookstore, and he saw a couple of his books, and he pulled one out and looked at it, and was inscribed to a friend. It was inscribed by him to a friend of his.
Oh, that's a little embarrassing, isn't it?
Well, what he did is got the book, packaged it, sent it back to his friend, and said, I can only imagine that somebody borrowed this and never returned it to you. And so he knew full well the man had sold the book.
Well, we're living in an era where people ask for autographs from celebrities just to resell them, so that was an early edition of that.
Well,
perhaps.
No, it wasn't. It was just he didn't care about the book and the inscription, and that was obvious. But the author wanted to get it back to him. Now, here's something that happened once, another little story. There was a man who collected very, very rare books on the American Native Indian languages in the Northeast. He was almost a hermit. I mean, he had a house full of these very rare books and very good books. He lived by himself. He finally passed on, and one of the big auction houses got his books, and they went for $12 million. He had a couple of daughters, and it turned out they were the heirs. So you'd think they're getting $12 million, and they were irate because all during their lives, this man lived like a hermit, had said he had no money whatsoever, never supported his wife or the kids, and now it turns out he had $12 million worth of books, and they were, I mean, they liked getting the $12 million, but they were just so irate that when they were growing up, they could have used a little bit of that money. And so it really does come down. Now, there's also the emotional attachment. I've mentioned this one on a podcast before, but I have a copy of The Night Before Christmas, not old, not valuable, but it's the one that I've read to my children and grandchildren. If I had that book in my hand and you were sitting here with $100,000, you'd have to try to wrestle it out of my hand, and I still wouldn't do it because it means too much to me and my family.
Yeah, I've got a couple of worn trade paperbacks that I would never give away. It is true. I mean, we read the words, we see the pictures, know the cover, and it's special to us. It may not be special to anybody else, or maybe, but it's a fascinating subject. And you're right, you're somewhat of an armchair psychologist when you go in to some of these places.
You have to be, because you have to go in and, in a way, you're a salesman. You're not, with the people, you're not selling them something other than, yes, we want to buy your books, this is a fair price. Once you've gotten those key few books out of the way, though, then it's simple. Now, one of the worst situations that can happen to us is that someone sells us the books, and then 3 weeks later we get a call that a friend, relative, brother had been intending to keep that book, and then sometimes finding it when we've had hundreds of boxes of books collected, which is really difficult, which is one of the reasons we also say, look it over first. If it means something to you, fine. And usually we do a lot of work and find it. Usually the book isn't valuable. We just give it back, other than we probably spend an extra 3 hours hunting for it.
A look behind the scenes, an emotional look behind the scenes. Ken, as always, it's fascinating to learn how it all works from your vantage point. Thank you so much for sharing, as always.
Well, thank you. And if anyone does call and has an estate, a library to sell, pull out all the sentimental ones first.